To our keynote speaker, those of you who looked at the program note that a great pleasure to have Dr. John Zangardi, who's going to be joining me on the stage shortly. John is the Chief Information Officer at the Department of Homeland Security from the United States. Dr. Zangardi was formerly the acting U.S. Department of Defense Chief Information Officer, responsible for IT and cybersecurity, satellite communications, and spectrum utilization. Prior to this role, Dr. Zangardi was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for C4I and IO and Space, where he was responsible for IT business systems, meteorological, oceanographic systems, and space acquisition efforts. Dr. Zangardi is also a retired naval flight officer who served in a variety of command and staff assignments. His rich executive experience in acquisition, policy, and legislative affairs, resourcing, and C4I operations makes him the perfect keynote speaker to start our second day here at NIAS. So with great pleasure, I offer the floor to Dr. Zangardi. Pleasure.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor. Most importantly, I want to thank Kevin for making this business casual. It really feels kind of IT. Next time when you do it, Kevin, you should say, hey, mandatory, wear jeans, open collar shirts, and don't shave for a few days. Then we'll look really IT. Okay, I'm going to go through a brief here that I put together for you guys to talk a little bit about DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and give you a little sense of that. But the real theme of the brief or discussion is about complexity and precision and where we're going in a very different world. So with that, let me start with what we call the flower slide. And if you look at it, it kind of looks like a flower. And you'll notice there's like blue colors on top and some gray colors on the bottom. What we're looking at here are the operational components of DHS along the top, and along the bottom are the support components. We're a very, very big organization, around 270,000 people. That's fairly big and sizable, with a great diversity of mission that's very complicated. So let me give you kind of a sense of it by just picking on a few of these. So if you look at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, not association, just so you all know, I'm still running at the pace of walking from the train station to here. There were no taxi cabs there, so we ran all the way over here to make it on time. So if I'm going a little fast, wave at me, I'll slow down. So FEMA is responsible that when something bad happens, tornado, hurricane, flood, they literally rush into a disaster area. Their tolerance for risk is really high. I mean, it would have to be. So you're going to go into an area where there's probably no power, there still may be floods going on, there may be disease, there's going to be people who are not too happy with life, people who are hurt. So you're going to look at risk from a very different lens than, say, a law enforcement agency like TSA, which I'll talk about a little bit more as we go into this. They have a very precise function that when you go to an airport in the U.S., they're going to screen you. So there's law enforcement in there with the immigrations and customs folks, customs, border, and protection folks. And those are along the top. So you've got those guys kind of in the middle. Then on the other extreme of very low risk tolerance is Secret Service. The Secret Service's mission is to protect the president and a lot of the politicals around him. They take risk very seriously. So you've got an organization here that has this high degree of complexity and a way of looking at risk that spreads out in very different directions. So you're dealing with an organization that you've got to look at things through many different lenses to ensure you get cybersecurity and networking right. Along the bottom, you have some organizations that are set up in support, like countering weapons of mass destruction. That's a pretty important function for DHS. You've got our intelligence and analysis folks. You've got people who work cybersecurity like CISA, which was the old MPPD, stood up to be sort of the cyber command for the .gov. So it's a very broad mission-oriented organization with a lot of responsibility. I like to refer to it as very heterogeneous in its mission space. So I wanted to deep dive on one point. You can look at the day in the life of DHS data through a lot of different lenses. I'm just going to pick on air, because it gives you a sense of the massive amount of complexity we deal with every day. So around this time of year, we're dealing with about screening 2 million, sometimes 2.5 million people a day that fly into, across the USS, so start in the US and end in the US, or over the US every day. That's a lot of data that has to go through our network. and it touches 440 airports in the United States. So our network has to go into there, it has to function, we've got to move all that data, we've got to analyze that data and clear all the passengers. And you'd be surprised, it's a very small number each day that we actually have to do manual screens on. This is over 23,000 domestic flights. So think of the complexity of this data, the complexity of the mission, and quite frankly, we want to get it right because ensuring the security and safety of the flying public is what this is all about. So this gives you an idea of how important it is for DHS to have precise information in a complex environment. It's a challenge. So for those of you who are history people, you'll know that the person I'm quoting from here, Bertolt Brecht, is an avowed Marxist. I apologize, but I thought the quote was good. The aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error. So we're never going to get it perfectly right, is the way I look at it, but we got to reduce the amount of error that we're dealing with. That's what's important for us when you're dealing with massive amounts of data. Now, it's about measuring, making sure that what you measure is recordable, right? It's got to be repeatable, and we have to have approaching zero tolerance for failure. Failure is not acceptable in an environment where you're ensuring the public safety, the national security, and the economy of the United States. What we do across the Department of Homeland Security is important. It's a fundamental piece of our national security and our economy. So we can't make mistakes. It was around the 1700s that people started to think about things differently. They started thinking about measuring things. And we were talking a little bit on the train the other day about it. They started asking very basic questions like, well, what's yellow? How do you define yellow? How do you define blue? I mean, the answer is pretty easy today. It's common sense. Hey, we might look at the wavelength. But think about it, back in the 1700s, when they were just beginning to open the world, the Renaissance was over, people were beginning to explore, commerce was taking off, the Americas were open. The world was different. We didn't have standard measurements across all the countries. Different questions were being asked to reduce error. And this is important because I think we're at the same place right now with cybersecurity and the amount of data we're dealing with. So I want to talk a little bit about the problem of longitude because I think this is an exemplar of what was happening back then. In 1714, an act of parliament in the United Kingdom set about something called the Longitude Act, excuse me. And that was about figuring out how to determine longitude at sea. At the time, timepieces were accurate enough to determine longitude ashore or on land in a stable platform where things were good. You know, being at sea on a rocking boat, high seas, whatever, getting a clock to work, pretty impossible. So this gentleman here that just got a little bit bigger, John Harrison, set about that task. It took him a long time to figure out how to get a clock that would work. The second piece here, this clock, that's called H4. If you go to some museums in Britain, you'll find that there's an H1, an H2, an H3, and finally an H4. This is the piece that succeeded. The task was to be able to have a clock that could provide time that was accurate to within 3 seconds a day. That's a pretty big achievement for a ship at sea. Now remember, these ships at sea at that time would typically dead reckon. They would look at pieces of land to know where they are. If they didn't have land and they had to get to a destination across the ocean, they might sail to the latitude of that particular location that they're going to, the destination, and try to go across. And that meant taking sunshots. They understood the declination of the sun so they could figure it out, or they can look at Polaris and get their latitude that way. I know I'm speaking simple navigation here, excuse me. But if it was a cloudy day, you were in trouble. Problem was you didn't know your longitude. So think about shipwrecks. Think about commerce and trying to know when someone would be where they were supposed to be, when they were supposed to be, or military operations. So the importance of understanding and measuring with precision in a complex environment was incumbent upon developing a timepiece that could do that within 3 seconds. So in 1765, they did. They figured out how to measure it, and that gentleman, he won a prize. It took him a very long time from the early 1720s when he started to 1765 to actually win the prize, and there was court cases and all that. But what this set in motion was a series of events where people became more ensconced in the idea of determining how do I measure things more precisely and reduce error. So they were at an inflection point. There was a trend here where fundamentally things were tending towards more precision. And the point I'm making here is that we're kind of going down that same road today. So when you look at today's IT environment, and I get to live in it, I lived in it here in DHS, I lived in it in DOD, and I lived in it in Navy. Wow, it's fast. Industry is developing things at such a rapid pace. It feels like some days you can barely keep up with all the new things coming out. When we sit back and think about the pace of change and all the companies that are bringing innovative ideas forward, you really have such a hard time to sort through the chaff. And that's even taking into account all the organizations that we could pay for help for us. So as a person who's deploying a network that has to secure a network that provides connectivity for 270,000 people in a global fashion, how do I pick the very best things to provide that security, connectivity, and modernized IT pace? It's really hard. We spend a lot of time looking at companies, but how do you really have the time to dig down into each one of them and really understand what they're doing? And then to take the marketing piece out of it and go, that was really marketing. What's the real story? That's an incredibly hard challenge to make sure you've got it right. And it is a fact of life that every CIO is dealing with today. Oops, well, sorry, didn't mean to hit that back. There we go. New technologies. Talked a little bit about it. We were in London yesterday. We were talking with Nominet. We're looking at that technology. I'm not endorsing it or anything, but we're going to dive deeper into it because spending an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours with a company barely gets you where you need to be. Sometimes we have to dig in and do pilots to really understand what it is. But there's a limit to the number of pilots we can do to explore these technologies. And the technologies keep changing. And at the same time as the new technologies are rolling out, I'm trying to deploy these technologies across a large network. Same case we had in DOD, same case in Navy. By the time you're getting almost done with deployment, there's something new that you have to consider. It's really quite a challenge. Let's talk about people. We have a lot of great people working for us. Technology's changing. I've got to train them. I've got to retain them. They're very tempted to go to industry because industry does pay a lot more money. So the challenge we have here is, how do I ensure that the mission and the tools I give to my people keeps them interested? Now, what we've done is things like cyber retention incentive pay to give them additional money that's tied to their training, so we pay for their training, and we tie it to their performance, and we give them some additional dollars as a means of keeping them there. But the key thing here is, how do we keep these people involved? Because we need their expertise. How do we get them to grow? Big challenges. The exponential growth of data. I sit on a ton of data. Last year, Congress put into law the requirement for DHS to have a chief data officer. So we have begun the process. I briefed our leadership, and they approved the appointment of an interim chief data officer. Brian Teeple is sitting right here in the first row. He is the interim CDO for DHS, the first. He has a task. Well, what does CDO mean for DHS? Right? What is the resources that he needs to do that? What are the authorities he needs to do that across an organization that is highly complex with a lot of components, 22 in fact, who have varying missions, who have varying degrees of risk? How do you find common enterprise approaches to do that? Think about the complexity of that mission. We also went about this year determining how to build our next new network. And imagine getting 22 component CIOs to agree to any one approach. The challenges in this environment, where it's so complicated, are very difficult. But we're working through them in a positive way, right? Achieving precision in a complex and changing data landscape is at the core of what we're doing and struggling to get through. So as we look at the pace of change, the new technology that's coming out, keeping our people trained and engrossed and on the staff and dealing with the data is a challenge we face every day. However, when you look at government, and I'm assuming many of us out there are government or military, one of the things we're really good with is routine. I like routine. I like to get up at the same time every day. I like breakfast. We like that kind of thing in our life. It's easy. There was probably a time when routine worked, right? So if you think back to how we used to authorize applications to go on our network, or software, hardware to go on our network, we really looked at it from a compliance point of view. And in an environment where the bad guy can pop up anywhere, and the boxes or technology coming down the conveyor belt changes all the time, checking a block for compliance doesn't work. But that's how government thinks in a lot of respects. We have spent a lot of time trying to change how we look at the world in our cybersecurity shop. Our CISOs have been struggling, and Luis Coronado's in the first row. He's the deputy CISO for DHS. We have been struggling to implement risk management. How do we look at risk rather than checking a block? How do we move our ATOs through the pipeline faster so we can get that new capability out there sooner? But understanding the risk. We've done things like authority to proceed, where we look at an application and go, how do I do reciprocity on the controls to make sure I can move it through quicker? How do I accept risk after I've knocked down all the high risk items? Just get it on the network. And while it's on the network, I give it a year. And at the end of the year, it has to mitigate or close all the risk items. But that's about getting capability out there faster. So we're struggling through this like many are, but we're dedicated to moving things more quickly. We've been looking very hard at how we do our trusted internet connections. We want to modernize them, reduce latency. We've moved to Office 365 as a means of improving our security. So, cybersecurity, the human is indispensable, but the human has a difficult time in an area of high complexity where precision is required. If you look at a lot of cybersecurity events and go through the logs, there's a lot of information there, and humans can't capture it. There's tools available to get through that, but the human is dispensable. How do we make him better, more capable to deal with the complexity? So one of the things we started doing is SOC optimization, Security Operations Center optimization. We look at it in 3 ways. And I'll get to the most important one last. The first one is across the contracts in DHS. We have 16 SOCs in the Department of Homeland Security, and all the manpower is provided through different contracts. I got the timing, I'll go faster. We are going to standardize our contracts. The second part here is we looked at processes and procedures. Having come from DoD, I looked at the cybersecurity services provisions, and we took it, tailored it to DHS, and we started inspecting our SOCs. We completed the first one in June with ICE. The ICE SOC in Chandler, Arizona was inspected. It passed 35 items. 30 were checked as good. 5, they have to do some mitigations. I signed a 3-year ATO. We're going to do that for every SOC. We're raising the bar. And oh, by the way, it's not us inspecting us. I hired DoD to inspect us. That's a big deal. So we have outside inspectors, standards, and we're inspecting, we're holding people accountable to those standards. The last piece is tools. How do we get the right tools to make that indispensable human better at his job or her job of securing the network? So we're working through these processes. Last year, we were in the crawl phase. This year, across these 3 items, we're in the walk phase. We're moving out and we're starting to do things. Threat intelligence is incredibly important. We did our first bug bounty a couple months ago. We're going to do more. We're going to keep testing our network. Some of our components are increasing their pen testing. We're working on red teams to make it stronger. Supply chain. How do I have assurances that what we're buying and putting on the network is good? We have to work through that problem. I don't have answers, but we're working through that problem. We're establishing the programs and ways of going about determining what are the right things to allow on our network. Cyber hygiene, that's been a foot stomper for me for years. We are moving out to Win 10. Our struggle right now is not getting to a current operating system. Our struggle is working within the Win 10 framework. So there's 3 versions of it available at any one time, and maintaining that rhythm of staying on a current version is what we're working on right now. We're moving out. We're having success. We've improved our cyber hygiene because our operating systems are current. That's very important. I mentioned network modernization. We're going to be releasing an RFP for EIS, Enterprise Information Services, fair opportunity here soon. This will be a single contract for all of DHS and help us move to hopefully a lower cost network, but a more modern network that implements ideas like zero trust and increased security for our mobility. Cyber talent management. We're looking at a new HR system across DHS that is different than what we've had in the past. If you look at the U.S. government civil service, it was established during the time of Calvin Coolidge. That's in the 1920s for those. It was revised under Truman in the 40s. Okay, that was the day of typewriters and tubes, right? Today we're working with iPads, we're working with artificial intelligence, we're working with machine learning. We are looking at moving to an environment that allows us to bring on cyber talent faster, and we should be able to pay them more. So part of this is testing these people in a more accurate way to determine their skill set. We will bring them on. People nowadays don't want to stay with an organization necessarily for their whole career, so we have to make it easier for people to move in and out of government with a greater degree of flexibility. Underpinning all of this is a move to artificial intelligence. I think it's key in an environment of high complexity to implement AI, ML, RPA across the environment to make the indispensable human more capable of dealing with the cybersecurity threats that are coming down the pipeline. But as I went through these 5 items, I think the key thread here is that we're moving forward to increase our precision and deal with the complicated world across a wide spectrum of activity. That's the key thing to making sure that we in DHS, I can ensure that we do our mission, which I've defined for my organization as protecting the network. If I can't protect the network, I might as well not have a network, to make sure the network connects and that people who rely upon the network can do their business, which means perform. Right? So the vision is to deliver world-class information technology and to enhance and support the DHS mission. And that is at the core of national security for the U.S. and our economic security. So, folks, I think I went a little over my time, but I thank you for having me here today. Kevin, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me a little time on stage to talk about the Department of Homeland Security IT initiatives. Thank you, everyone.